My name's Mark Godfrey. I'm very pleased to be here with Beryl Korot. Beryl is celebrated for being one of the pioneering artists working with video, and also was the editor of several publications in the early 70s around the emergence of video art, and over the years has worked with a number of different mediums, drawing, with weaving, and with kind of giant scale works incorporating video and music. And we're going to talk specifically today about a work that is here at the fair and is also on display at the moment at Tate Modern, where I work. And it's a work called Dachau 1974. And it's a work I first came across in the Whitney in a show that was curated about 10 years ago by Chrissy Isles. So Beryl, I just wanted to start off by asking you how you came to work with video in the first place. What was the, did you go to art school? Did you start working with painting, or did you just start off straight with video?
I actually started off with the magazine, which was really my first art medium. I thought I was a poet. And I graduated college, but I always knew that my life wasn't really going to start in terms of what I wanted to do until I left college. And so I ran into an old friend whom I'd known at the university. And he was very involved, that was Ira Schneider, in film. He was going for a doctorate when we were students in neurophysiology of the brain. And during that time, he started working on films. So I met him in Lower Manhattan, and he said, there's this incredible piece of equipment that's just come out by Sony Portapack. And I went over to his place, and he showed it to me, and we began to talk about it. And this was in Lower Manhattan at that time. A lot of people were beginning to buy the Portapack. And one of the things that we found, Ira and I, very early, is that there was really no communication between the people who were beginning to work in terms of what they were doing, or any communication with the outside world about it. So he was talking to another woman, Phyllis Gershony, introduced us, and we decided that it was time to start a magazine, which we called Radical Software, which was really about the decentralization of information and access to information, which we thought was all the potential of this new medium. And that's actually...
What year was this?
This was 1968.
Okay.
And then the first issue of the magazine came out in 1970. And for me, it was really, when I said it was my first art medium, it was the first time that I had actually begun to work tactily, not, with transforming photographs into halftones, onto a page, specking type, making a newspaper, without knowing what I was doing, except that somebody had come down from Time magazine, because one of our people had a connection, and gave us a day lesson in how to put a magazine together. So that was actually how we started.
So basically, as far as I understand, you're saying that you started out editing the magazine about the potential of the video medium.
Yes.
And about other artists' interventions with video before you started making your own.
Yes.
And how was that transition to sort of deciding to start making or experimenting yourself? How did that happen? What did you do?
Well, I was in a state of mind of extreme openness and looking for my medium at the time, which, given that I was a poet, going into text kind of made sense. And but I was surrounded by people who were working in the medium and constantly getting in touch with me or Phyllis, constantly passing through the loft that we had. So it was kind of inevitable. I would have, had to be completely out of it, not to be drawn to everybody's excitement about working with this new medium that especially filmmakers were thrilled with, because there was no processing involved. It was instant feedback. It was sync sound, which was a huge thing. And we set up a theater for people to bring material to the loft, and it was just natural that I would pick up a camera.
What we're seeing here is that slide there, that one of the issues of Radical Software. And how many of these issues did you edit? Were you involved with? Did it come out frequently, this journal?
I don't even remember. It ran for 4 years. This was volume 1, had 4 or 5 issues. This was volume 1. And we did a really interesting thing for volume 2, because most of us at that point really wanted to get into video and were tired of becoming the information venue for people learning about it. So we actually farmed out issues of the magazine to different groups around the country. We had a publisher who provided us with production money, and if people contacted us, different groups that we had been in touch with and were interested in putting out their own issue of the magazine, we sent them the production money, gave them the specs for the size that we needed, and then they sent it back to us. So I always like to think about it as an early kind of website mentality of people actually generating their own information and us just being a conduit.
Were there particular artists working with video at this time that impressed you? Namjoon Paik or others who were working with that medium, or perhaps exhibitions that you saw around this time?
Well, I was definitely, I enjoyed, in Lower Manhattan at that time, everybody was friends. So, Namjoon was a neighbor. And I definitely, enjoyed his work. But the 2 people actually whose work was most influential to me were people who were actually part of this Rain Dance collective, who were part of this radical software group. And that was Frank Gillette and Ira Schneider, and they really did the first, what I call, multiple channel works. And what attracted me to multiple channel as opposed to single channel, we were very interested in getting people out of the broadcast television viewer kind of relationship and thinking about what information flow was at the time and what media ecology was, how information and how it was delivered to us had an impact on who we are as human beings. So for me, the multiple channel format was saying, you can't even watch this in your homes. You're going to have to come to a public space and watch these little monitors rearranged, spread out through a space, playing with time against itself, sculptural. And so those 2 guys pioneered that with a work called Wipe Cycle, which was shown at a groundbreaking show at the Howard Wise Gallery in 1968 called Vision and Television. And essentially, people would walk off the elevator into the Wise Gallery and see themselves in 8-second delay, 16-second delay in a kind of rotating 9-monitor configuration, which was also showing pre-recorded original material and material that had been taken off of broadcast television. But what intrigued me, and just about everybody who walked into the gallery, was how their image was grabbed and how they were seeing themselves back in time and back in time again in relationship to this other information. And that piece in particular, later with the piece that we're showing here, Dachau 1974, had a huge impact on me.
We'll come to this, but I think what's very interesting about a lot of artists' work with video at this time was the emphasis on the present tense. Video, as opposed to film, had this facility of instant playback or playback at these slight removes of time, like 8 seconds, 12 seconds. Did you have a sense at the time that was the big division between video and film, the different purchase on time?
Well, of course, film is a time-based medium, but the fact that, I guess this was why the multiple channel work, because I actually conceived of it in a way. It's very musical when you have time on a number of different channels and you can begin to relate them to one another. So that was... So
let's skip a few years and get to the moment that you made Dachau 1974. Can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances of being in Germany? How come you were there? Why you decided to go visit Dachau and so on?
My boyfriend at the time, whom I later married, was on a DAD in Berlin, and he said to me, "Come on over and visit." And this was 1974. The Holocaust at that time was really barely spoken about. of course, everybody knew about it, but even the survivors weren't talking about it. It was just an enormous hole, black hole of conversation. And in order to, I was a young artist, a young Jewish artist living in New York City, and to go to Germany had just a lot of meaning to me. It was just almost, I could not go without doing something about that. So I said to Steve Reich, my husband, if I come, then I have to go visit Dachau. So he said, okay, as long as you're coming. So I said, yeah, I'm coming. So that was how actually I went to Germany with that in mind, took the Porta-Pack, drove down to Dachau. And it was a very strange time because Berlin was incredibly isolated during those years. And the first day that I got to Dachau, I didn't take my camera at all. I just walked around the camp. It was a rainy day. It was incredibly dreary. And I had really no expectations except to take the camera with me and see what there was. And what there was a tourist site. It was 1974. It was, completely cleaned up. Nothing was going on except to show what the architecture had been, what the artifacts were, and tourists who were moving through the space. So that became Dachau 1974. I'm always writing to people when they say, oh, your Dachau piece, I always make sure that this 1974 is tagged onto that, because this was really not Dachau 1940, not Dachau 1945. It was as I found it in 1974 as a place to visit for tourists.
So the next day you went back after walking through the first day and not making anything. And did you sense when you started filming, like how you'd go about it, how long you'd record, whether you'd record the people or whether you wouldn't record the people, whether you'd try and kind of go through the camp in terms of a narrative, all of those things? Were those decisions you made pretty quickly?
Those were decisions that I made very quickly, and which was why the day before was kind of very useful to just walk through it. It's not a very large space, and there wasn't really very much in it. There was a museum, but I wasn't going to deal with the past. So there were really only barracks and walkways and the wall outside the camp. And so I really just very logically began to shoot everything that I saw there, which was the outside of the camp with traffic passing, the inside of a wall, barracks far away, barracks close up, inside the barracks, coming out of the barracks again, crossing a bridge, going to the crematoria, and then going back to the bridge to look almost in a pastoral scene with barbed wire kind of dropping on the water, of people. Actually, at the end, you just see it as a pastoral scene, as a place of total quiet. And, if you remember, what is this place now, this place in 1974, in terms of memory? The piece really depends, in a sense, on the viewer coming with something of this place. Or some people who actually came to the space at that time at the kitchen thought that it was some kind of prison camp, but really didn't know what it was. So even without any knowledge, there was something of that in the way the images were structured and the way the rhythms of the channels worked against one another that conveyed that. And that was, in a way, my question. What's left here? Can you, through the architecture that's left here, tell anything about what went on? And so in the structuring of the work, going from outside the camp through it to the pathway to the crematoria and out to kind of the quiet nothingness of the landscape was my way of asking a question about it.
Well, okay, so I think there's two main structures to the work. One is the actual sequence of images in time, and you've said when you start watching, you have images of the outside of the camp, you move through parts of the camp, you get the images of the crematoria, and you end with the image of the river, which is, as you said, a kind of pastoral scene. But the other main structure is the fact that it plays on 4 channels, on 4 monitors, in a particular kind of installation that we're seeing here. And I was wondering if you can take us through the thought processes that you went through after making the footage in Dachau, and how you decided on 4, how you decided on pairs, and how you decided that each video would be showing a kind of a clip from a section of the camp that would be lasting for 7 seconds or 8 seconds or so, and so on. So that structure.
Right.
And that structure is imaged in a diagram that you later made, which we see over here.
Well, when I came back from Dachau and I began to look at the footage I had shot.
In Berlin or back in New York?
Back in New York.
Okay.
Back in New York. No, I don't remember looking at it in Berlin. It's possible I did. But when I came back to New York and I started going through the footage, it was on tripod, very, very static. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? But I had been in very close contact with Ira and Frank, who were working in the multiple channel medium that I had loved. And in earlier that year, actually, I had become interested in the hand loom because I realized when working on radical software and beginning to work in video, that the information in all these mediums, all these technologies, was encrypted in lines, which actually, when I realized that with print and with video, that actually was what drew me to the loom. I think there was an article that had come out in Scientific American on the Jacquard loom around that time, which was the first punch card computer in that it programmed pattern according to a numerical structure. And it's also obviously a very ancient tool compared to the video technology, but it's got a similar way of encoding information in terms of lines. So somehow, while I'm looking at this footage, and I had also worked, Ira had just done a piece called Manhattan is an Island, and I had actually worked with him making that piece. It was his piece, but I was like his assistant on that. So, multiple channel was in my head, but I wasn't interested in kind of random relationships or even just a lot of the work that these people whom I was very interested in were doing were kind of more sculptural pieces in space, or as with Wipe Cycle, had a live action type of element to it. So it really, in a way, you have these, sometimes you have an epiphany, and the way in which these three mediums that I had been working with were structuring information in lines, the fact that I wanted to somehow bring life to these images that were just kind of deadly if it was a one-channel piece, and the fact that I had begun to think about the loom all came together to make me begin to realize how I wanted to structure it. And actually, once I realized that the loom was going to be the key, the whole thing came very easily. To bind a cloth, you need 2 sets of 2. Your basic tabby structure is, your under over is 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. So channels 1 and 3, that's the outside of the camp. 2 and 4, that's just the wall over it. But I didn't want it to just be a repetition of those of 1 and 3 and 2 and 4 and make what I'd call a 2-channel piece on 4 monitors. I wanted to give it liveness, but it wasn't going to be the kind of liveness that Frank and Ira had worked with, let's say, in Wipe Cycle. And that was a very big part of early video, was looking at feedback of oneself and that kind of thing. But I wanted something more structured in terms of musical relationships. The loom itself, when you're doing a notation, actually looks a lot like the score on a musical page, and I was thinking along those lines at that time. I was living with a musician who had no problem making compositions with, a quartet where you had different people playing parts. So all of these things came together, and I decided to assign a static rhythm to it. Just in a loom, you program a pattern and you set it, and that's kind of the way it goes for the whole work. So out of that influence, in terms of making a system that continues, that kind of is what happened with Dachau. In making a different rhythm for each of the pairs, so they interlock at slightly different times, but have the same information on them.
And I mean, I think that's one of the just kind of completely amazing things about this work is that your decision that you wanted to make a work about Dachau as you found it rather than Dachau as it had been. And, you know, you must have recognized it was impossible to make a work about Dachau as it had been. But that decision was then, you know, given a formal aspect by the fact that the viewer is kept very much in the present tense. And they're aware of these images that are happening in front of them because of, as you say, not just the fact that there's 1 and 3 and 2 and 4, but that 1 and 3 are not exactly the same, but that this staggeredness. Can you just say something about your decision about installing the work? Because you talked about the use of the sculptural form of the monitor in other artists who were working with video. The fact that they used the monitor as a cube. But what you did is that you decided to place the cubes of the monitors behind a wall, and you also put a bench at a certain distance and a carpet. And here we're seeing the installation that took place at the kitchen in 1974, I think. And tell us about that installation.
In the early days of video, there were quite a few people who had come out of film, so there was a lot of discussion about how video was different from film. So in a funny kind of way, the original wall, the wall for Dachau, was taking a film screen and puncturing 4 holes in it. And that was really how the thinking for that framing came to mind. And at the same time, it's a very frontal work. It's a work that has to be read. It's not a gestalt. It's not a work you kind of wander through. It's really got the pairs of channels really make a narrative. And so that's really what happened.
There's a kind of a question I wanted to ask that I forgot to ask, which is just a little bit, without kind of going down the total geeky tech side, but how difficult was it at that time working with video to produce segments and clean cuts? And, you know, you wanted the segments to be 7 seconds each. Nowadays, I've been in several studios where, you know, you go into a studio, there's 25 massive Macs set up, everyone can make those cuts very simply. Was that a difficult thing to do? And what about the backstage of this? How difficult was this to set up?
Well, a lot of people would have thought that it was really difficult to do that. But I really had this sense of technology, which I've kept through my whole life, which is to keep the hand in it as much as possible. So it meant that I had to get really good with a stopwatch, my eye looking at a little X mark, you know, Xing the spot, because you were able to measure, almost like a tape measure on a dress or something, that the distance between a certain point where you wound the tape to another point was 2 seconds. And you could literally, you wound back, you looked, and when you saw the X, you pressed your stopwatch. And you knew, or you had the stopwatch running and you stopped it, you stopped the deck, and you got good at this. So the piece, you'll see when you're looking at it, even though we have it synchronized right now, there are changes when the 1s and 3s or 2s and 4s change to another, what I call image blocks. They don't just happen on the dime. 1 and 3 do not happen at exactly the same time to go into another segment. There's always a lag, which is my hand in it. And that to me was actually really important to have the hand evident in that, which is something actually today that would be a little bit different, but the hand comes in other ways.
I now want to kind of ask about the reception of the work. I've done a lot of thinking over the years about the community of artists in Lower Manhattan, and also just, you know, how many of them were Jewish and how many of them in some way had their lives were impacted by the Holocaust. Eva Hess once looked at Carl Andre's sculptures and said they reminded her of the concentration camp, although she had no experience personally of the concentration camp, but had been, you know, a kinder transport from Hamburg. And then there are artists who were present in that area of New York, Mel Bochner, Sol LeWitt, Richard Serra, who later, 25 years later, went on to do commissions that involved sites of Holocaust memory. But at this time, as you said, in the early 70s, the Holocaust was barely spoken about. So I was wondering if you can say something about when you showed this work with this title, Dachau 1974, What was the response? Were people mainly talking about it in terms of what you were doing with sequencing, in terms of narrative, or were people interested in what it meant for a video artist to go into the camps and to make a work a site of memory?
I don't really remember any talk about the fact that I had gone to Dachau, but it was definitely very present in people coming to see the kitchen show. It brought in a lot of people. If it had been, something else, I don't know that it would have caused that kind of response. But what people were talking about at the time was how it was structured. That was really the conversation. But maybe more silently, just as with the Holocaust not being discussed yet or recognized, it was something that was definitely a backstory to the thing, but never anyone ever talked. And on the invitation to the kitchen show, there's the structural diagram we were showing before, and in the tiniest letters, equivalent to maybe 8-point, I wrote Dachau 74 because I was quite self-conscious about it at the time. I was, not ready to talk about it or...
I find it really interesting. Just one of the things that
I will find in writings about this piece. However, over the years, I could be in a show with 30 people, and a reviewer would come in and review 29 works, but one work was not reviewed, and that happened quite a lot. It was really remarkable.
Right. No, I've done some research on a series of paintings that Frank Stella did, and he showed in New York like 5 times. From 1970 to 1974 that are called the Polish Village series. And they're made after a book he was given called Wooden Synagogues. And there must have been about 40 reviews in Art Forum in America, all the magazines about these shows. Not one mention of the fact that the paintings were titled after synagogues destroyed in the Holocaust. But it's but I also think the reason why this work may have not been talked about in that way was that it was so uncommon for an artist to address a site of memory at this point. Not just the Holocaust, but the whole emphasis on video art was the present tense, the live feedback. Rosalind Krauss was writing about the way artists would often make videos of themselves and would be interested in watching their own image on the monitor as they recorded a performance. And this was doing something completely different and ahead of its time. But I also wanted to ask you, when you made it, were you aware of other treatments of the camps in films, like Night and Fog, for instance?
No, I didn't. I actually never saw Night and Fog till later. And certainly Shoah and those hadn't been done yet. What I was familiar with was the actual footage. Somehow on television, from a really early time on, they showed pretty hairy images of the camps and the liberation and stuff. You'd just be a little kid really watching television, and there it was. And I remember seeing that, and that had an impact.
And you obviously made a very clear decision not to intersperse any archival footage or any documentary footage in amongst these screens. That was there right from the beginning when you visited Dachau. You weren't going to use that kind of material.
No, right from the beginning, I had no idea what I was going to do. It was just that what I found there had nothing to do with what was in the museum there. It was so I couldn't know that. So I was really interested in what I could know and what was left for us to know. That was what I was interested in.
Can you talk a little bit also about the sound in the piece? How you recorded sound, was that easy to do with video at the time? And also, there's one sort of very present aspect of sound that, apart from the shuffling of feet and people walking through, but there's one kind of sonic moment, the bells. Can you talk a little bit about the piece from that perspective?
Well, in those days, and I know that since I had never been a filmmaker, I didn't know much about, when filmmakers went out, they often had to take a sound person with them. It was a whole big deal. But since I had the camera on a tripod, I had this omnidirectional mic with me that I simply, so if it's pointing at the barracks and there's a whole bunch of tourists behind me, I simply directed it at them. And that was how the sound was gathered. It was really simple.
The bells, I think, are quite
Oh,
ominous.
and the bells were from a nunnery. Actually, that was like timing. They went off when there's a nunnery next door that had bells that rang, and they went off when I was in there, and that's how that happened, actually.
I mean, they come pretty soon connected to the moment where you're filming into the crematorium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The laughing, though, that people think that they hear that came from people in the museum was not really from the museum. It was a woman. It was a beautiful day, and a woman was playing with her child and laughing, So that was also that picks up something of the ambiance.
Now, in terms of the sequence, as you've already said, the last images are images of sort of outside the camp and the twinkling of light on the stream and of trees. Why was it that you felt you wanted to sort of end on that pastoral note? It's interesting, actually, because in Night and Fog, the opening scene is this pan from a field, which you think could be a kind of just a sort of normal field, but it's a rustic scene. It's kind of beautiful, and then the camera pans from the field to the exterior, and almost it's the opposite in Dachau 1974, because it opens with the exterior of the camp but ends with this pastoral scene. So were you thinking about that in terms of hope or regeneration or anything metaphoric, or was it just what you saw?
Well, it was what I saw, but it also, at a certain point, it was what is there to say, because in a way, before the enormity of the Holocaust, what is there, so it was silent. So it ends on silence without the people.
We're in an art fair, and triggered by this, I wanted to sort of ask a little bit about the support. This is going in a new direction, but the support at that time for video art in New York. As far as I can recall, the next big show you had after The Kitchen was at Leo Castelli, right? So in what way were the galleries supportive of video art practices at that time?
There were no galleries for video art. There was The Kitchen. There were the beginning of places around the country. There was David Ross was very, very active as the first video curator in terms of getting things placed in different places. And I still have an archive at home that has, that I should probably go through someday, which has people writing to me, actually through Radical Software, gee, we'd love to show that, but we can't get the equipment. In New York State, which I was more familiar with, they set up a creative artists public service program, and the New York State Council on the Arts were enormously supportive of video. There was a guy there named Peter Bradley and Lydia Silman or something like that, and they just were very interested and very determined to get funding for video. So anybody really who was working in the field could get funded. I mean, I got funding every year. It was amazing.
But what was Castelli's
and
role
Castelli's role was really, he had a thing called Sonnabend Castelli Tapes and Films, and I guess they sold some single channel stuff to, I'm not sure to whom. At that point, it was the very earliest collectors. I don't really know who would have collected at that point. It didn't last very long, so I don't think that they did too well that way. But he was very open to showing the video at that point because he was that kind of a dealer. And as a result of the kitchen show, and Richard Serra had loved the structuring of the work and had gone across to talk to Joyce Nareau, who ran the Castelli Sonnabend Tapes and Films, and said, hey, you should show something of hers. And
so we're now looking at an image of the show in Castelli, text and commentary. We've got about 5 more minutes, but I just wondered if you could say something about how this came out of Dachau, how the thinking to do with the correspondence of weaving and video technology that you'd looked at during Dachau led you to make this work and install the video work in this way with the tapestries.
Well, when I finished making Dachau, that whole analogy to the loom really was very important to me. It wasn't a metaphor. It was that I had discovered a way of putting information together based on this 1-3-2-4 structure that was able to convey a narrative. And I felt that this, and the whole line thing about how information is encoded, really said to me, this is telling me something about how human beings organize information. At the same time, I had this physical need to make an image for the camera by hand. So all of those things were coming together, and I had bought myself this fantastic Swedish loom, and I decided I was going to weave a work for the camera. I had a camera hanging over the loom, which I would lower to get closer and closer. And I was also interested in how different materials could try and describe the same thing, but could never say the same thing because they were in a different material. So so the video portion of text and commentary could never really tell you. It was the video commentary that could tell you more about the weavings than you would see if you just walked into the gallery, because you could actually see the process of this line by line image filling the screen. And they were each programmed differently, so that I was interested in the fact that you could program pattern differently. I used to ride the subways in New York and go, oh, that person doesn't know that they have a 4-3-2-1 pattern that they're walking around with. The numerical basis of pattern was fascinating to me. And that's pretty much, also after Dachau and before I did text and commentary, I did a lot of weaver's notations. I would go to a little coffee shop in my neighborhood and sit there in the mornings and do these notations. So it combined the hand and the camera, and it was just a very rich period for me working across mediums.
And I just want to come to just one more work that you later made with Steve. And that's the cave. And in the cave, I think some of the research that you'd done, or some aspects of Dachau became useful to your thinking around this, particularly around narratives. And it was again a work that was based on an incredibly important site. In this cave, the cave where Abraham's buried. And I was wondering if you can.
Is there another shot of this, just so you can see the 5? Okay. So this work was made from 89 to 93, and it was just at the time when Photoshop was coming out, and it was you could grab an image into the computer, zoom in on it, and bounce it back to video. So here's a man, Ephraim Isaac, in this piece. Essentially, and the structure of this piece really came right out of text and commentary. With 1, 3, and 5, and 2, and 4, and then variations of that throughout the work. And the fact that there were these pauses in the work, I mean, I could talk about, the cave is it's just a huge work to talk about in 2 seconds. But
more if what you were doing in Dachau may have come into the cave, right?
Right. Well, what I was doing was working in these pairs. And because, as I mentioned before, once you're working in time in relationship to itself, the way I had structured the information with these pauses, which are like rests in music, it was, when Steve first saw Dachau, he said, wow, this is a very musical work. And it was on the basis of knowing that and text and commentary that he felt that we could collaborate together, because the weaving structure became kind of the mise-en-scene for the work in which musicians and singers were placed around. And I was able to take a musical score. We had a common language of SMPTE, which is time code. So anyway, with that, I'll tell you briefly what the cave was on 1 foot. We went to 3 places in the world. Well, actually 2. We went to Israel and East Jerusalem, and we asked 2 different groups of people there, Israeli Jews, Palestinian Muslims, who for you is Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. And in the first 2 acts of the work, first the Israeli section, then the Palestinian section, the answers to those questions created a kind of portrait of who these people were. And in this particular section, whenever a person appeared throughout the work, that abstract pattern where it was the suspenders that this gentleman was wearing, and which I zoomed in. So you see like an oral and a visual portrait of themselves throughout the work. And in the last section, we came back to America, And in that case, the first person who was interviewed, so you go through these first 2 acts where you get these very serious answers to who these characters are. You come back to America, and the first person we interviewed, or the first person that we edited into the beginning of the piece, was Liz Lecomte from the Worcester Group, director of the Worcester Group. And we asked her, who for you is Abraham? And she paused and she said, Abraham Lincoln. So the whole cultural passage from one part of the world to another was said in that moment. Or Hagar was no longer an oppressed woman or a woman who wasn't understood, but in America she became the first single mother. So the piece it kind of takes an ancient text that many people in the West know exists but are not really very familiar with, and it kind of turned the camera at the end on us to these incredibly creative interpretations that were more often than not based on too much information, but enough of a gestalt that it resonated. Anyway, that.
I've got one question which isn't to do with any of these works. One final question, which when I first read Radical Software and the essays that you wrote and the essays you edited, that was about 10 years ago, or 15 years ago maybe, and I was really impressed and kind of amazed by the radical aspirations of the video medium in amongst yourself and other artists in the early 70s, where the push was that communities, instead of just receiving news, receiving information from the networks, communities could begin to make their own news, make their own information, distribute their own information using the video technology. There was no need, given the Portapak, given the video technology, to merely be a consumer. You could be a producer, and you could no longer be kind of controlled by state mediums, corporations, and so on. Now, since that time, in the last 15 years, we've seen YouTube and the fact that everyone uploads their own information all the time, every second. How is this the bad dream coming true, or how do you see that transformation?
I think I can't possibly comment on that on one foot now, but we're definitely in an information we're definitely having to figure this one out. Radical Software was concerned with media ecology, the relationship of the information environment that human beings lived in. And I think that the jury's way out on this one right now, but people are becoming aware of it. For a long time, I thought people were just thinking about the information highway for the delivery of information, and no one was talking now about the ecology, the media ecology that we were talking about then. I think there's a guy, Jaron Lanier, who was the inventor of virtual reality, wrote a book recently, something, Why We Are Not a Gadget, something like that. And so people in the field are beginning to, critique what's going on, and it's so vast, we couldn't possibly have conceived of how vast and fast everything got to where it is now.
Great. Well, I think we've got to come to an end. I can't remember, Claudia, whether we've got the opportunity to take questions, but it would be good to if we've got a little time. There's a microphone that's going to circulate. We have one question over here.
Hi, Rudolf Freeling, Curator at SF MoMA. I was wondering, since, Mark, I understand you show the work at the Tate now, and Beryl, for you, seeing the work now in 2014, sort of related to Mark's question about YouTube, things that have changed, how has your perception of the work changed over time after these 40 years?
It's interesting. Museum audiences, when I first showed this work, were not into sitting for 24 minutes. I mean, that was long. But they did come in and spend that time with this work. And then there is now the video art, actually, and video art at that time was kind of, you had to sit with it. And we see a lot of works here where you have to sit with it. I don't know that my perception has changed so much with this work. You know, there was so much going on when I came up in the field that I see a lot of things now kind of not even that different in a funny kind of way. People are still there's more sense of place, more people are thinking of place. There's multiple channels that are dealt with in an environmental way as they were then. The quality is better. But do
you have a sense of other artists working with, let's say, subjects to do with the Holocaust who are as interested in structure as they are in narrative?
No, there's more interest in narrative. But I think there was still, even at the time that I came up, there was less interest in structure than in narrative. There was a lot of critiquing of the delivery system of information, you know, like Martha Rosler or people like that. And I always thought that was kind of backward thinking, that they were talking about radical politics, but they weren't really changing the format for the delivery of the information, which was really what interested me. So, and maybe that's not really it's more filmic in a lot of ways now. And
there is one great piece by Omer Fast called Spielberg's List, where he,
I didn't see that.
I mean, it's an amazing piece on 2 monitors where he basically goes back to Poland to look at the actors who played as extras in Schindler's List, and he also looks at the sets that were constructed of the camps. And instead of just showing this in a straightforward way, he uses incredibly complex editing to collapse the difference between people's real memories of what was going on in Poland and people's memories of being on set with Spielberg and the film itself, and the 3 things kind of interplay. So it's really about the delivery, but he does that through editing and pairing of monitors and structure. That's a piece I think kind of comes out of your work in some way. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, we've run out of time, but thank you so much, Beryl.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.